Trojan War was perhaps both the most impactful and legendary event that shaped the culture and identity of classical Greece. Myths and legends of the famed Achaean expedition that burned down Troy were known to all, and were most famously told in the epics of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Homeric lore was considered historical by the classical Hellenes and was deeply embedded in the ancient Greek tradition. However, beyond the fog of Greek mythology, we actually do not know that many details when it comes to its historicity. What we do know is that the war itself did take place during the end of the Bronze Age. The foremost power of the Aegean Sea were the Achaeans, as they were called by Homer, or the Mycenaean Greece as we typically refer to them today. To the Hittites, the great Bronze Age power of Asia Minor, the land of the Achaeans was known as Achaea or Ahiawa. Throughout the late Bronze Age, the Hittites continuously contested the Achaeans over control and influence of Western Anatolia, including the city of Troy. Inevitably, both sides would see their civilizations fall in the flames of the Bronze Age collapse. We also know that both Hittites and Achaeans engaged in one or several direct military conflicts over Ilion, known as Wilusa in the Hittite sources. However, when it comes to Homer or Greek mythology in general, the Hittites were never mentioned as taking part in the Trojan War. Or were they? One seemingly insignificant mention of a military force of the so-called Keteioi was made in the Odyssey, dashing from the east in attempt to help the Trojans avoid destruction at the last hour. Could this have been a reference to an actual Hittite army that came to Troy's aid? A reference that were perhaps buried by the countless myths of the Homeric cycle. In this episode, we analyze the possible historicity of the Keteioi. Historicity of the Trojan War has been long debated among the scholars, especially when it comes to the numerous details described in the Iliad and Odyssey. The conflict is traditionally dated to a period between 1194 and 1184 BCE. These dates, provided by Eratosthenes, an ancient Greek geographer, astronomer, and mathematician, among other things, precisely correspond to the destruction of Troy 7a, the final archaeological layer of the Bronze Age site of Troy. An alternative date, on the other hand, is provided by Herodotus as 1250 BCE, thus definitely placing the conflict in the late 13th or early 12th century. That is, at least about 400 years before the development of the Hellenic alphabet and the first recorded sources for the Trojan War, the works of Homer. While we can easily rule out participation of the Olympian gods and other clearly mythological parts of the story, Homer does deliver some strikingly precise information when it comes to what would be the historical participants in the war. Mycenae, being the Achaean capital, together with large palatial centers such as Pylos and Tiryns, among others, were all reduced to ruins, either nearly or completely abandoned by the time of Homer. And yet, he correctly placed them as some of the chief powers behind the Achaean expedition. On the Trojan side, Homer also correctly identifies numerous allies of Ilion in great detail. Dardanians, Pelasgians, Thracians, Phrygians, Carians, Lycians, and many others were all listed among the Trojan allies. However, one historical power was seemingly never mentioned by Homer, the greatest Bronze Age power in all of Anatolia, the Empire of the Hatti. Furthermore, it appears that the classical Greeks that came after Homer did not even have any knowledge of the Hittites. When it comes to the late Bronze Age, the Achaeans regularly interacted with the Hatti and continuously competed with them for the control of Western Asia Minor, including the influence over the city of Troy. The Hittite ladder, dated to mid-13th century BCE, was sent by the Hittite king to the king of Achaea, and particularly mentions a past conflict at Troy over which the Hittites and the Achaeans went to war. Could this be the evidence we are looking for, perhaps perfectly corresponding to Herodotus's dating of 1250 BCE? Or could it perhaps be an earlier conflict, also possibly referred to in Greek mythology? In a generation before the Trojan War, Heracles himself led an expedition against Ilion, in which he sacked the city and deposed and killed King Laomedon. This myth also corresponds well to the timeline of the events mentioned in the Hittite Tawagalava letter. Either way, Hittites would continue to correspond with historical Troy, or Wilusa as they called it, throughout the 13th century BCE, even directing their allies and clients in the region to help restore a deposed ruler named Walmu on the Trojan throne. The question is, then why would the Hittites not be mentioned by Homer? Or were they mentioned by Homer? This brings us to the Keteioi, mentioned in a single line in the Odyssey, as a last-minute relief force sent to help the Trojans in the 10th and final year of the war. As Odysseus wanders on his post-war voyage, he ends up in the underworld, where he meets the fallen Achilles. The two then talk about Achilles' son Neoptolemus, who had survived the war and grew into a great hero himself. Many men did he kill in battle. I cannot name every single one of those whom he slew while fighting on the side of the Argives, but will only say how he slew that valiant hero Eurypylus, son of Telephus, who was the handsomest man I ever saw other than Memnon. Many others also of the Keteioi fell around him by reason of a woman's bribes. These Keteioi were not mentioned in the Iliad, which ends shortly after Hector's funeral and does not extend until the end of the war. They seemingly arrive towards the very end of the conflict, their leader Eurypylus killed by Achilles' son Neoptolemus not long before the Trojan horse sealed the fate of the city. Homer does not give the background on who the Keteioi were, leaving a lot of room for interpretation. Likewise, the subsequent writers never seemed to address the Keteioi or provide much info on them. Instead, Eurypylus and his father Telephus became associated with Mycia. The Mycians were already mentioned by Homer as separate Trojan allies led by Chromis and Eunomus. Seemingly, Mycia was not a unified kingdom at the time, possibly with separate Mycenaean groups aiding Troy at different parts during the war. Or perhaps, the Keteioi were very little known to the archaic and classical era Greeks, who themselves had no previous knowledge of the Hittite existence either. Perhaps in those circumstances, the little-known Keteioi became associated with the neighboring and better-known Mycenaeans in the Homeric lore. When it comes to the possible connection between Keteioi and the Hittites, there are several things to consider. We do not know which term the Mycenaean Greeks used to designate the Hittites. We do know that the Hittites called themselves the Hatti, and we do know that the king of Achaia or Achaia used the word Hatti, but in a translated Hittite version of the document. However, if we take the Egyptian term for the Hittites, which they called the Keti, we find a very strong resemblance to the Greek language Keteioi. Moreover, if we dive into the background of the Keteioi leader Eurypylus, there is another clue potentially tying him to the Hatti. The name of Eurypylus' father, Telephus, is very similar to that of the Hittite god Telepinu, one of the chief deities of the Hittite religion. Telepinu's name was also used by Hittite rulers as their personal or regnal name, such as King Telepinu of the late 16th century BCE. Could it be that the Eurypylus of the Keteioi, son of Telephus, arriving to help the Trojans at the last moment, was actually a Hittite leader coming to the aid of Wilusa? Such absence in the Trojan War, and perhaps aid arriving too little too late, could perhaps be explained by the heavy Hittite decline and period of chaos leading to the Hatti's own destruction. The Hittite capital Hattusa was itself sacked at around 1180 BCE, with the Hittite state dissolving shortly afterwards. If we take 1184 BCE as the date for the fall of Troy, it would be explainable why the Hittites would send little or no help. Perhaps the Mycenaean Greeks indeed called Hittites the Keteioi. Perhaps they did take part in the Trojan War after all. And perhaps this was vaguely known to the Greeks earlier in the Dark Ages, and then forgotten throughout the centuries, with only the names Keteioi, Telephus, and Eurypylus diverting into other stories forged by Greek mythology. What do you think? Do you think that the Keteioi really were the Hittites? That Telephus was indeed originally based on Telepinu? Did the Greek knowledge of the Hittites eventually fade away during the Dark Ages, with glimpses of their memory being attached elsewhere to other Hellenic myths? Or were the Hittites already gone by the time of the destruction of Troy 7a, and thus took no part in the Trojan War? Do you have your own theories? Let us know what you think in the comment section. Thank you very much for watching, and see you again soon.